Welcome to this video called Sticking the IMC Deadstick Landing. How hard is it? For the record, I'm filming this on February 15th of 2021. Let's jump right in. So, what if we as controllers are presented with an aircraft with an engine failure and that aircraft is within gliding range of a suitable airport? For the moment, I'm not going to worry about what happens if an airplane is not within gliding range of a suitable airport, although in that case, then we're probably doing the best we can to prepare them for some kind of off-airport landing. Now, but assuming that they're within gliding range of a suitable airport, what if it's VMC? What's our job, and what's our job responsibilities if it's IMC? Well, if it's VMC, it's relatively simple. There's going to be some drama, but at some level, the controller's responsibility actually isn't that hard, okay? Our job is basically to issue just one vector towards the airport, help the pilot acquire the airport visually, and then just let them do their thing and maneuver as needed so they can land on the runway. Now, there's always going to be a little bit more to it than that, but at some basic level, that's our job when it's VMC. And frankly, once the pilot acquires the airport visually, and again, we're starting with an assumption that the airplane is within gliding range of a suitable airport, they're going to be high enough that they can certainly reach the runway. And now if they miss it, that's an accuracy issue, and the fault lies with the pilot. Maybe they fly too far out before they turn back and they suddenly short the landing. We do want to protect for that, but at least if that happens, in effect, that's the pilot's fault. And same thing if the pilot kind of keeps the pattern in too tight and they're too high and they overshoot the runway. Okay, we're going to be in charge of sending out rescue vehicles and providing meaningful assistance. But at some level, the fault for the overshoot really lies with the pilot. But what if it's IMC? Well, suddenly the responsibility that the controller has ramps up very dramatically. Here's why. In this case, our job is to vector the aircraft not only to the correct, and I'm putting the word short in there, short final approach path, but also at an altitude that allows the pilot to land within the length of the runway. Preferably, they're able to land early enough on the runway that there's room to brake to a stop before they run out of pavement. At least we'd like to get them down onto the runway itself so they at least have a chance to get it down, start to get on the brakes a little bit, get slow before they run off the far end of the runway. Those tend to be fairly survivable. But let's think about this both laterally and vertically. So laterally, when we normally vector aircraft, when it's IMC, we're putting them on an instrument approach, obviously. So we're vectoring them, 5, 7, 10 miles out from the runway to intercept some kind of navigation signal that the pilot then acquires and uses for lateral tracking. In these cases, it will be the definite exception rather than the rule that there will be the gliding energy to intercept, 5, 7, 8 mile final, right? We sometimes are going to vector airplanes to be joining final approach within just a mile or two of the runway, sometimes even less. And they're not going to have time to acquire some suitable navigation signal and intercept it and line up. We're vectoring them all the way in on something really short in many cases. Yikes, that's going to be hard. Now, controllers should be able to do a reasonable job with this. I mean, frankly, any radar controller should be able to do a halfway decent job of vectoring somebody to line up with a path, although we're just getting one shot at it. There's going to be a lot of stress, so that's difficult. But at least on a relative scale, that part's kind of easy, and historically, I think we've done a decent job of that when controllers have been faced with this in the past, and we'll probably continue to do so in the future. However, we also have to get them to an altitude within an altitude window that allows the pilot to land within the length of the runway. I'm going to focus in this video on that vertical window part, and I'm going to kind of assume, perhaps almost unreasonably, that we're going to get the lateral part fine, even though the lateral part itself is fairly challenging. So let's focus on that vertical window a little bit. I want to first start with 4 examples. 2 are specific aviation accidents that did result in multiple fatalities, and then the other 2 are going to be some non-aviation examples so we can kind of get our head around what it is we're looking at. So the first example I want to show you was the fatal crash of Bonanza 375 Bravo. It took place in 2013, and this was cited in the NTSB's Safety Recommendation Report 16-004, and the short version for our present purposes about this one is that the controllers in Florida got the airplane lined up with final approach, but they brought the plane in too low. He shorted the landing. So let's look at the NTSB Safety Recommendation Report that I alluded to a second ago. This is the one that came out in 2016 entitled Emergency Training for Air Traffic Controllers. And as the NTSB does when they put out these kinds of reports, they provide multiple exemplar accidents. One of the accidents they cited was this one here, January 4th, 2013, Palm Coast, Florida. This airplane experienced a loss of engine power and struck a house because it shorted the landing by about 3/4 of a mile while on approach to Flagler County Airport, Palm Coast, Florida. The private pilot and 2 passengers died. I will note there were people in the house. They escaped without injury, and the airplane itself was destroyed. IMC prevailed, and an en route IFR clearance was obtained. Let me just explain that last part there. The pilot was VFR on top of this underlying overcast layer, receiving flight following. He was IFR capable, so was the airplane. When he had the engine failure, a quick IFR clearance was obtained, but it was IMC down low. It was basically about a 900-foot broken ceiling, 3 miles visibility, and so for our purposes, this is an engine failure IMC, and so the pilot requested vectors from the controllers. Now, the digest version here says, although the failure occurred almost directly over an airport, and that's fair enough, I have no quibble with that, the air traffic controller vectored the airplane away from the airport, and the airplane crashed about 1 mile short of the runway. It was actually about 3/4 here. They're just simplifying a little bit. And so the NTSB determined that contributing to the accident was the pilot's failure to clearly state that the aircraft had lost all power. And without getting into the specifics, that was a slightly complicating issue here because there was some question about whether it was a partial failure or a total failure. But also the air traffic controller's incomplete understanding of the emergency, which resulted in the controllers vectoring the airplane too far from the airport to reach the runway. So he starts pretty much over the airport, gets vectored too far away, and then shorts the landing. If you'd like to see a little bit more about this in detail, here's the final report for November 375 Bravo. Here's where it's loosely going to talk about cloud ceilings of about 900 to 1,000 feet, being about 3/4 mile from the airport. It gives a little more detail here in the factual information, and here in the meteorological information you see that the official ceiling was 900 broken with a visibility of 3 miles. They also put out an air traffic control group factual report, and for our purposes I just want to focus on 2 things. Here's kind of the overview. He first reported an engine problem when he was about 7 miles south of Flagler. By the way, Flagler has since been renamed. It's no longer X-Ray Foxtrot Lima. It's now Foxtrot India November. It doesn't really matter. But he first reported a vibration in the propeller and declares an emergency. The decision is made quite rightly and reasonably to go to Flagler, and they vector him. If I go to the next page and then kind of zoom in a little bit for a little more detail. The red dots are radar returns. Radar contact is lost here. The actual impact into the house is right here off of Seminole. I think it's Woods Boulevard, over there about 3/4 of a mile short of the runway. But you can kind of deduce that the airport was reachable. I mean, the airport's only down here, and if you can go this far plus all the way to here before you run out of energy and get to the ground, if only we had vectored them in maybe a little bit tighter, we would have been able to do it. But if you vector them in too tight, then they go too far. But at least to a first approximation, the controller did a decent job of getting this airplane lined up more or less on final approach. The expectation is that he would break out of the clouds at ballpark 900 feet AGL, would be able to correct slightly with a right-hand sidestep maneuver, and get to the runway. As far as lateral alignment, the real problem here is because of the vectoring, we contributed to them shorting the runway. Okay. That's the basic setup on that one. There are other examples. I use that one because it's pertinent. Another one I'll use to illustrate the opposite problem was the 1987 crash into a Ramada Inn hotel of an Air Force A-7 jet. Here, controllers at Indianapolis Center and Approach Control managed to get the aircraft lined up properly for runway 5 left, but they brought him in too high. For what it's worth, I happened to kind of ad-lib a mention of this in my current version of the Flight 4 video. Let me just show you a small snippet of that video to show it to you. I'm going to start with the video muted. And just explain what I was doing here. This is an older version. This is actually a simulator we have at Indy Center with an older version of Flight Sim that has a glider. And here was actually doing a demonstration of a particular principle technique that's applicable to some gliders about how to handle VFR and IMC when you don't have instrumentation in the glider. And by the way, in case you think I'm cheating, notice the attitude indicator is not correct. So when I popped out of the clouds at about 3,000 AGL, then I was able to get my bearings, figure out where I was, and maneuver over towards the Indianapolis airport. But listen to the little ad-lib comment as I pop out of the clouds here, and I'm just trying to look at the local area. I knew I was roughly within the Indianapolis airport area, but I truly didn't know exactly where. And watch to listen to see what I say as I'm just ad-libbing and I figure out where I'm at. Okay, that's interesting. Looks to me, let's see, that's executive drive. So that should be the Sam Jones right there. Huh, that's actually the parking lot where the A7 crashed into the Ramada Inn back in 1987. That's unplanned. It just happens to pop out there, and I know where that is. Okay, just the point is I just kind of recognized where that was. It turns out, whoops, wrong one. I got to go all the way back. I happen to know where that is. So here's the Indianapolis International Airport, and I mentioned the Sam Jones Expressway and Executive Drive. Executive Drive is this kind of distinctive road right here that has this nice big wide grassy median in the middle that's kind of angled, so it's not north, south, east, west like most of the other roads around here. And what happened with this particular A7, they were vectored in. The engine failure occurred at flight level 310. He was only 15 miles from the Indianapolis International Airport, and even for an A7, that's definitely reachable. So they vectored in into runway 5 left. Now, the airport has changed over the years. This is the current 5 left. That was not 5 left. That didn't even exist back in 1987. 5 left back then was this runway here. Actually, back then it was just runway 5. But anyway, this is the end of the pavement for runway 23 in the old days, and you can kind of make out the vestiges that have had X's on them for a number of years. The old runway ended right down about here, about where this terminal is. So it's about a 9,500 foot runway. And what happened was the controllers got him lined up successfully, but he was too high. So he was still in the soup with about a 800 foot cloud ceiling, and he was at 2,200 feet AGL when he gets to the runway threshold. So I'm putting this as if he could see the airport. He couldn't. He was still in the soup. As he was descending, okay, and I'm going to kind of mimic this with Google Maps here. This here is runway 1432, and about the time he was crossing that at 800 feet AGL, he realized he was out of runway here, and he was looking at some bad spots. He attempted to make a quick right 270, and if I can move the camera the right way, as he did that, he realized this just wasn't going to work. At that point, he was too low. He thought he had the airplane aimed at some kind of open area, and of course this has changed over the past 30 plus years, so don't read too much into this exact construction here. But basically, he thought he had it pointed towards an unpopulated area. He ejected at 500 feet. It clipped the roof of this building, which back then was a bank, and it went into the lobby of the Ramada Inn, which was basically in the middle of what's been this parking lot here for a number of years. If you go to Wikipedia about this, here's that building where he clipped the roof. He ended up in the lobby of the Ramada Inn. And this is going to provide some detail about the actual accident. 9 people were killed essentially instantly, and the 10th person died a few days later from the burn injuries. Okay, but in this case, we got them lined up, but they were too high. So just how hard is this really? Now, 2 other examples, and I use these to illustrate the difference between something that's reachable and an accuracy metric. And here's why. Let's think about basketball for a second. So I've lived in Indiana for 30 plus years, and you would think I would have learned how to do a free throw by this time. Sorry, I can't do a free throw for the life of me. Now, I'm clearly strong enough to not only get the ball up to the basket, but heave it well over the backboard if I'm so inclined. But trying to get it in that little tiny basket thing is tough. You know, my free throw percentage is probably on the order of 10%. Interestingly, even the very best free throw shooters ever in the history of the NBA have free throw percentages of about 90%, you know, and they can certainly reach the basket. There's a difference between reachability and accuracy to get a small target hit. You can think about a dartboard, for example. Anybody's strong enough, you know, from 20 feet back or whatever, you know, to throw a dart as far as the dartboard, but to actually hit that little tiny bullseye in the middle is tough. That's a reachability versus an accuracy thing. And I think what happens when we think about this situation where we have an engine failure within gliding range of a suitable airport and it's IMC, everybody says, oh, well, it's reachable. The controller should just be able to vector them into this tight window. What I'm exploring in this window or in this video is the question of, well, just what's the accuracy question? How small is that bullseye? How small is the hoop through which you have to get the basketball through? That's what we're looking at. So I'm going to show you what I've designed as kind of a proof of concept. It's not perfectly accurate down to the nth detail, but I want to get you to think about a probability spreadsheet and what that's going to look like before I show it to you. So before we do, I want to start by kind of throwing out 3 true-false questions to you. Here's true or false question number 1. Short runways make the target smaller. In other words, is it harder to vector somebody successfully into a 2,000-foot runway than it is into a 10,000-foot runway? So true or false? Short runways make the target smaller. And the answer is true. You got that one right. Congratulations. All right, you're 1 for 1. True or false? Low cloud ceilings make it hard for the pilot to make last-minute adjustments laterally or vertically. In other words, it's going to be tougher for us to do our job if it's 200-foot cloud ceilings versus 1,000-foot cloud ceilings. The answer again, congratulations, you're 2 for 2. You got it right. True. True or false? And you guys are all smart. You know this one is maybe going to make you think a little bit. True or false? Airplanes that glide well make the controller's task easier. In other words, the better the airplanes glide, the easier this is, right? Answer is false. Why is that? That is counterintuitive. And if you don't get that, you won't understand what I'm talking about when I deal with some of these things. I have already spoken about this. I put something in the Foundational Ground School Lesson 4. I'm going to watch just a little bit of it. I'm going to start the segment at 114, but I don't want to watch the whole thing here. So I'm just going to start it to show you where you can watch the whole thing in context if you want. I'm then going to skip ahead a few minutes, and we're just going to watch about a 2-minute snippet. That's the most relevant part for our present purposes. Rated controllers. Okay, so it was the section about gliding variability, and if I come forward to about the 4:54 mark or so, this is the about 2-minute section that I'm most interested in. Longer for our purposes at the moment. Okay, here's the catch. We think it's good to glide well. It seems intuitive, right? Here's the problem. Let's take this line. I'm just going to do a Control-C, Control-V to copy and paste this, and that way it's parallel. I'm going to attach the line at the same angle to that other red triangle. Don't have to be exact for my present purposes. But what that means is, and I'll just use a short green vertical line about a runway length out to kind of represent the size of the target window that we have to get the airplane through vertically at some distance out if they're gliding well so that we can hit that bullseye in the first place. Of course, if they land a little long, they might stand on the brakes and go off on the runway somewhat slow, and that's usually fairly survivable unless it just drops off with a cliff face or something. Okay, here's the catch. I'm going to take this line, I'm just going to delete it. I'll leave that green line there. I'm going to leave that one attached where it is, and I'm going to make this a bit steeper. And let's play with this one. So let's take this line. Let's do a Control-C, Control-V. This one's parallel to that one. Let's take this and attach it to the top of that triangle, and what you'll notice now, if I just get a second copy of the green line and go about that same point, we now have a much larger target window. So late stage, even though it might be counterintuitive, I will be arguing later in these advanced videos that it's actually good for the pilot to get the airplane to glide poorly once the airport becomes reachable. That is not an intuitive thing. Now, this is not called gliding steepness. This is called gliding variability. So you're smart enough to know maybe it's good to kind of keep your options open. And if I attach this to the bottom of that green first line I had drawn, maybe it's better to actually think about something like this. Okay, I'm going to end it here. So the basic idea, and this does not attach actual numbers, but the concept is valid. A pilot, when they do their visual maneuvers, assuming it's VMC, they tend to glide as well as they can to get to the airport with altitude to spare, but then as they're making their maneuvers, very often once pilots what pilots do and the way they think is pilots will say, okay, well, I've got the runway made. Now they're going to put the gear down, flaps down, and they, maybe do some slips or S-turns or whatever turns they're going to make. The bottom line is they're intentionally gliding poorly to make the runway. For controllers, when we're vectoring somebody IMC, if we just try to have somebody glide at best glide speed all the way in, it actually makes our job more difficult. And so, within some bounds, I want us to have controllers deliberately glide less than their best or worse than their best glide speed and their best glide capability, because that makes the task easier, but I also want to preserve some variability aspect to it. So, okay, one more thing about the spreadsheet, and then we'll take a look at it. When I show you the spreadsheet, the numbers that you will see on the spreadsheet that are getting calculated, they represent vertical window sizes, some numbers of feet. So you might see a number that says 326 feet. That's the vertical window through which we have to get the airplane, okay, in order to make it to the runway. And the numbers you'll actually see on the spreadsheet assume that there's enough runway to get it down and stop before you get to the end. That window becomes slightly bigger if we're allowing a little extra distance for an overrun. The window itself is going to be essentially located at the runway threshold. However, if the pilot breaks out a bit before the runway threshold because the cloud ceiling is high enough they can do that, that's where that's where W-H-E-R-E. That's where they start the steep descent visually. I hate typos, but oh well, I gotta take ownership on that one. That's where they're going to start their steep descent visually at the last second. All right, so without further ado, let's go to the spreadsheet. When you first look at it, it's like, all right, what are you looking at here? So let's get our bearings. Across the top, I have cloud ceiling. I've kind of highlighted in yellow some representative values of 200-foot ceiling, 500-foot ceiling, and 1,000-foot ceiling. And then over on the left, I have the runway length. The runway length numbers can actually move around a little bit because one of the things I can input is the expected ground roll. So a lot of GA airplanes, you might think the ground roll is going to be something on the order of 1,200 feet. If we assume that we've got a training airplane, somebody can get on the brakes and get it stopped within 800 feet. As soon as I hit enter, watch the runway lengths change. Basically, I'm just starting with a runway length that's 200 feet longer than the expected ground roll. We'll leave this up for discussion purposes for a moment. So in other words, let's think about this. If an airplane's going to take 800 feet to get stopped on the runway, and we're trying to stick them into a postage stamp of a 1,000-foot runway, that's going to be almost impossible, right? Well, the size window mathematically that you would have to hit coming across the runway threshold is 22 feet. You could come over the runway threshold at essentially 1 foot, or 22 feet higher. You could still get it down in the first couple hundred feet and then get it stopped within the remaining 800. But you'd have to hit as a controller a little tiny 22-foot window. How in the world are we going to do that? First of all, altimeters can have some minor errors, and they're still perfectly legal and safe and certified. Okay, errors on the order of 50 to 75 feet. Usually they're more accurate than that, but they can certainly have that kind of error. There can be temperature adjustments that we don't normally think of, and every once in a while we get this reminder about these cold temperature airports. You know, that's when it's exceptionally cold and it's a bigger difference, but in principle, those differences are there for both hot and cold days that affect the accuracy of the altimeter in ways that are generally speaking irrelevant. The altimeter setting itself might change over time. You know, if we have a METAR and we're basing the altimeter setting off that METAR that's 30 minutes old, well, the altimeter, the barometric pressure might have changed by say 0.03 over that 30 minutes. Well, that's a 30-foot difference because they haven't updated to what's accurate. Okay, you get a whole host of errors that collectively mean that there can be errors on the order of 150 feet or so. Plus, as controllers on our radar screen, we only see altitude in 100-foot increments. I mean, how in the world, when there's up to 150-foot error on the altimeter, okay, in some physical sense, and we only see altitude in 100-foot increments, are we supposed to hit a little tiny 22-foot window? I mean, that's essentially impossible, right? Now, take the same situation and put this airplane onto a 10,000-foot runway. We have a vertical window that's about 1,000 feet high. That's much larger than those altimeter errors and the resolution issue we have on our radar screen, and plus it just gives us a little more leeway in case we haven't brought our A++ game, and so that's why this window is larger and it makes it easier. Now I'm going to put this back to 1,200 just for discussion purposes here in a minute. Another thing that I can change is the airplane glide ratio when it's clean, and by clean I mean gear up, flaps up, cowl flaps closed, propeller, if it's a controllable pitch prop that can be adjusted, it's the high pitch, low RPM position, and the airplane's being flown at something like the best glide speed for its weight and so on. And so again, for a lot of G airplanes, that's going to move around, but 9 is a representative number. Let me explain this dirty fraction. Dirty fraction is not referring to the percentage of the population that throws out expletives every once in a while. Dirty fraction is what I'm calling the idea of an airplane gliding at, say, a 9-to-1 glide ratio when it's clean, when the pilot purposely makes the airplane dirty, that is, gear down, flaps down, stuff like that. How much worse can they glide? So this airplane, the way I've got it set up where it's 100% dirty fraction, it could be 100% dirtier, so to speak, and so that glide ratio of 9 would become about a 4.5, okay? And the basic thing that affects is the cloud ceiling type stuff. So for example, let's just pick a 4,400-foot runway. Well, at a low cloud ceiling altitude, the pilot breaks out so low, there's no meaningful time for the pilot to go, ooh, I'm a tad high, and try to get the airplane real dirty and glide worse in that last couple of 100 feet or so, and therefore these windows are smaller. As we get to higher and higher cloud ceiling, so maybe the pilot breaks out at 1,500 AGL, okay, the window effectively becomes bigger because there's more time for them to get the airplane sort of extra dirty. So that's what that's referring to. For the record, if I change this dirty fraction to 0, watch what happens to the colors here. All of these lines go horizontal because the pilot under this can't glide any more poorly, so it doesn't really matter if they break out early. If they're a bit high, they're still stuck, okay? If they could somehow magically make the airplane glide, let's say 500% worse, okay, you get a definite sort of slope to these lines because every little bit of extra cloud ceiling, let's say they break out at 1,000 feet for a 4,600 foot runway in this case, they break out at 1,000 feet and they're definitely quite high. They can make the airplane a lot dirtier, so they have a much better chance. I think for a variety of airplanes, 100% is some kind of reasonable assumption. Don't worry about the ceiling to dirty buffer. That just means that I'm kind of playing with the idea that once they break out of the clouds, they're going to spend about 200 feet where it's going to take them just a couple of seconds to get the airplane sort of dirtied up. So the first couple hundred feet after they break out, you don't really get a benefit, and that's why this is so small at the 200-foot cloud ceiling. They basically have no chance to get the airplane dirtier. All right, the color coding numbers, 400, 600, 800,000. I will play with those numbers in a minute, but the basic idea here is that's attaching some kind of loose probability to different size target windows. In other words, I've got almost impossible set to 400 feet. In other words, any window smaller than about 400 feet, I'm kind of loosely thinking is almost impossible for most controllers to hit these days, assuming that the winds aloft are pretty much nil and we're not getting any meaningful practice or training if you've never thought about it. So just all of a sudden, once in your career you're faced with this, even you manage to get them lined up with final approach, you're trying to hit a 400-foot vertical window as they cross the runway threshold. Effectively, that Bonanza down in Flagler was, and I haven't crunched the numbers here, was effectively 1,000 feet low. The A7 in Indianapolis was basically 2,200 feet high. I've actually seen that number in actuality. All right, we're having to hit like a 400-foot target window. I think that's almost impossible right now for controllers to achieve. Okay, you could throw in a different number if you think that should be something different. I'm loosely considering a 600-foot target window very difficult for controllers to hit. 800 is difficult, and 1,000 is kind of maybe. At the moment, though, I do think that if you have a target window that's more than 1,000 feet, that's probably good. And so, if you over here, you have a 1,700-foot ceiling for this airplane and a slightly more than about 10,000 foot runway, you have an 1,144 foot window. I think controllers should be able to do that. It's not guaranteed, but there's a higher probability. Now, I will play with this difficulty multiplier in a few minutes, but let's just kind of get our heads around this. I think for that Bonanza 375 Bravo, runway 29 at Flagler is 5,500 feet, and it was a 900-foot ceiling. So let's kind of think about how difficult that was on that day, assuming that these numbers are accurate, assuming that these numbers are accurate, which I think they are in good faith, and I'm going to assume that these numbers are all reasonable numbers. So a 5,500-foot runway, I'll just go to 5,400 feet, 5,600 feet, somewhere in there, okay? So somewhere about 54, 56, it was 900-foot ceiling. In effect, what I can say is that there was about a 550-foot target window that we had to hit. That's going to be very difficult. It turns out that the controller ended up effectively shorting the airplane. In fairness, though, on that particular accident, the NTSB did not address, and I think the NTSB had a major oversight on this one, they did not address the winds aloft, which was a complicating factor. And again, I am not saying this to somehow defend controllers. I'm saying this completely legitimately. I think that because there were winds aloft, it was extra difficult on that day. Oops, without being too specific, if I attach about a 1.5 number to that, okay, I think that what we're looking at here is, where are we? Right about here. I think it was an almost impossible task for the controllers to get Bonanza 375 Bravo through that window on that day. I can defend that in good faith. The A7, we had about a 9,500-foot runway, and it was about an 800-foot overcast ceiling. That airplane, was probably gliding a bit worse, something on the order of 7. I cannot vouch for that exactly. I'm assuming about a 4,000-foot ground roll for an A7. I don't know that he could have made it much dirtier at the time. It's probably more or less. He can't do a whole lot with gear and flaps at that point. So I'm assuming that these are kind of reasonable numbers for that A7 back in 1987, and for what it's worth, 800-foot cloud ceiling, 9,500-foot runway. You know, we're looking at something like, okay, this is maybe doable. Okay, it's kind of flirting with difficult, but we still managed to miss it. Now here's the thing. Let me switch into sort of legal mode for a second. You know, suppose you're a basketball fan and you need your favorite basketball player. I don't care if it's Steph Curry, who I believe off the top of my head has the best NBA free throw shooting percentage ever. Maybe since I'm from Indiana, I should be thinking about Reggie Miller or Larry Bird. Okay, and you know, you need them. They got one free throw to make, and your life depends on it because you're being vectored IMC, and their free throw percentage is pretty good. They're somewhere up here in the green, right? Okay, well, there's a 90% chance they make it. There's a 10% chance they don't. Are we going to sue them just because they missed a free throw, even though it was, they had a good chance of doing it? What happens is, again, I'm putting my legal hat on, which is not my primary concern in all these videos. What I see is controllers are faced with this incredibly difficult task, and there is a certain probability, and even when the odds are ticking up, it's still not guaranteed. And what happens is we miss the runway kind of low, or we miss it kind of high, and we get this lawsuit like, you controllers shouldn't be able to do this because it's reachable. I'm sorry. No, there's also an accuracy element, and here I'm at least taking a stab at attaching some reasonable numbers, even if these numbers and the assumptions behind them can be refined over time. But that's not really my purpose. So what is my purpose in sort of playing with these numbers? I'm going to go back to something that's more representative of a fairly typical range of GA airplanes, so we're no longer looking at A7s. I think that these are reasonable numbers here. Let's go back to the spreadsheet for a second. Okay. Here are the kinds of practical uses that I have in mind for the spreadsheet. And keep in mind, the spreadsheet I built so far is really more a proof of concept thing. It can certainly be refined. And let me show you one area where it can certainly be refined. I think my numbers become a little bit murky once you get above about 1,000-foot cloud ceiling, because if you break out at 700 feet, you really don't have time maybe for something like S-turns in a typical GA airplane. For a typical GA airplane, let's say you break out at 1,200 or 1,600 feet and you're quite high, you can actually, in effect, make this dirty fraction higher in that case, because you at least have the option of some S-turns as well on about a mile or a half-mile final. And so the practical effect, if I were to incorporate that in here, is see the slope here of the kind of lower part of the red as it kind of is going up as it goes to the right. Once you get to about 1,000-foot cloud ceiling, that would tend to arc up over here, and so this like bright red might disappear at something like 1,600-foot cloud ceiling, because with the higher cloud ceilings, you can make that dirty fraction higher. Okay, so the spreadsheet can be improved if we want to, but one of the things that we can use this for is to compare different techniques, and I've put in parentheses, see my website, so let's go do that real quick. So on the emergency website, under the emergency categories page, this particular video that I'm shooting right now is going to be under this section about aircraft engine failure, and specifically when it takes place, IMC, and that's going to be this video here. What this is going to do, among other things, is help us understand which techniques are better. So I have multiple techniques here. One, I have a proposed IFR deadstick controlled crash procedure. It might be, and I'm not quite to this point yet, but it might be that we're going to recognize that when it's 1,000-foot ceiling and we're trying to vector somebody to, something like a 4,000-foot runway, which there's a whole lot of 4,000-foot runways over there, that's very difficult. Maybe not almost impossible, but it's sort of flirting with it, right? If it's an airport in an urban area and there are rural areas nearby, it might be perfectly defensible and best to say, okay, pilot, here's the deal. We can try to vector you for this runway. It's going to be just about impossible for us to do. Would you rather head off to a rural area and just end up in a field somewhere, and you probably walk away? If you head for the airport, there's a small chance we're going to be successful hitting this little tiny bullseye, in which case you're perfectly fine, airplane's fine, but the probability is we're going to botch this either high or low, and you're going to end up in a house or a hotel, and you're going to be dead. Which is it, you know? So you can at least envision, in principle, a conversation like that, though presumably a little shorter and a little more diplomatic, okay? But that's what that IFR Deadstick controlled crash procedure is. If the airplane's not within gliding range of a suitable airport anyway, we're sort of locked into that from the get-go, and then this becomes all about making that as successful as possible. If it's a airport within suitable gliding range, and we're going to go to that because the runway is so short, especially with the cloud bases, and we want to talk somebody into that, and they say, okay, yeah, we'll take you up on that heading for the field, then we would also use that to maximize the odds here. But if you're going to try to make it to a runway, you first have to know what your aim point is. I discussed that in that video. And then in videos I have yet to film, depending on the particular geometry, you're going to use what I recommend is either the downwind technique, the base leg technique, or the final approach technique. I'm not going to get into the specifics of those. You can sort of loosely deduce what those are based on the names. And for the downwind and base leg techniques, whether there are calm winds as far as winds aloft or decently strong winds aloft makes a big difference in the specifics of the technique. Again, I'm not going to get into that here. For what it's worth, if there are strong winds aloft, it does not particularly affect the final approach technique, so that's why there's not a separate one there. Or you can use your own. But the basic idea is what I can do is take the concepts in this spreadsheet, including the numbers, to try to help evaluate when I start looking at those techniques, how successful I expect those to be and whether they might work, and I can compare one to another. For what it's worth, and I'm not going to go to it here, if the airplane is reasonably high and the winds aloft are pretty low, I love this no wind, downwind technique. I think that even with altimeter errors, we should be able to consistently hit about a 300-foot window. And therefore, these numbers change. I think that if the winds are calm and we've trained and people know how to do this, okay, I think this multiplier goes to something like that, and suddenly it makes it a lot easier to get somebody into a runway. Now again, that assumes calm winds, the downwind technique. Other techniques are going to have higher things and so on. And if there are strong winds aloft, then we can't just turn them off. We're going to have to deal with it. And so that multiplier goes up to something higher. So even with training, maybe it looks like that. But the basic idea is you can at least get your head around assessing those probabilities using a spreadsheet like that. Okay. Another thing is you can investigate after an incident or accident and see how probable it was. I've already done that for Bonanza 375 Bravo and for the A7 that crashed into the Ramada Inn here in Indianapolis in 1987. Also, you can conceptually use it before or perhaps in rare cases, during a live emergency. And so maybe you would use that IFR Deadstick controlled crash procedure. So what I mean by that is this. I'm going to go to the web again real quick. I'm going to go to SkyVector, and I've got it centered on an area up in northern Ohio. So this is the area roughly around Findlay, Ohio, and I'm going to use this for a second purpose in a moment. For the moment, let's just kind of ignore all of that. And let's assume that whoever owns this airspace, whether it's Cleveland Center or maybe, it's probably not Cleveland Approach or somebody, but whoever owns this airspace, okay, let's say we're thinking about bringing an airplane into Wyandotte County. We're just evaluating in advance, like how hard is that going to be? Well, the longest runway, I'm just eyeballing, it looks like it's 1836, is 4,000 feet long. Okay, well, how hard is it to get a typical GA type airplane into a 4,000 foot runway? At least conceptually, we can start to evaluate that using the spreadsheet. So a 4,000 foot runway, man, most of the time that's going to be very difficult to do, okay? And even if the cloud ceilings are up higher, and again, maybe that should arc up a little bit, so maybe we're ticking into the green, but that's, difficult to very difficult, sort of loosely described. That's going to be tough. However, and this is even at the 0.8, maybe if we train and get better at it, we can kind of get our heads around the idea that this suddenly becomes more viable. But you could use the spreadsheet for that kind of idea where you're using it before an emergency. In cases where there's a little bit of time available and some supervisor who's able to bring this up, really is twinkle fingers. And by the way, I very much doubt this would ever get done. I suppose it's possible that even during an emergency, somebody who's not directly involved with the accident could actually be looking, and we're trying to put them in somewhere, kind of throw the numbers in there, make sure you get it all set up. I think that's very unlikely. So I'm not looking really using the spreadsheet during a live emergency, but I think this might help us get our heads around the idea that on certain days. I'm just going to throw this back at a 1 for a second. That, you know, if we know what runway lengths we have available in our area, okay, on a given start of a shift, we might just have an idea that the cloud ceilings on this day happen to be ballpark 600, 700 feet, and therefore certain runways we might even kind of designate in advance. You know, if you have any runways that are less than 5,400 feet and somebody loses an engine IMC, it's probably better from the get-go just to send them towards a field. So I'll just sort of loosely go back to this area around here. You know, mayday, 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 engine failure. Need vectors to the nearest airport, and we've in effect already decided that, you know, if it was an 1,800-foot ceiling, okay, maybe that's viable. I haven't looked at the numbers on the spreadsheet, but with a 700-foot ceiling, sir, or ma'am, whatever, we've already calculated, and we know the area that much of this area here is rural. That what we do is we're basically vectoring them intentionally over towards a farm field instead of a runway. Now, does that open up a can of worms, right? Because you know what's going to happen. We're going to end up sending them towards an area that's full of farm fields, and they're going to manage to pop out of the clouds and hit like the 2 trees that are on the boundary between a couple fields. Somebody's going to get killed, and then we're going to get the crap suit out of us, because they're going to say, well, the pilot specifically requested an airport. You sent them over towards farm fields. At least conceptually, one option we have is to think about that in advance and say, you know what? At the time we made that decision, this was almost impossible, and this had a high likelihood of success. It was not guaranteed. We went with the high probability thing. Now, maybe we don't go down that road because of liability concerns. I will give you my opinion. I think that, at least in principle, without getting into the details, crunching the exact numbers, I think that's defensible. And for the test that I have in mind about my butt in the airplane, that's actually what I would frankly prefer. But again, I realize other people might differ on that, especially when you think about that. A lot of people really like that siren call of the runway, and now we're vectoring them towards a situation that may or may not be bad. Okay, last point. We'll go back to PowerPoint for a second. One final thought. I'm requesting some help from one or more volunteers to help build what I'm calling a Deadstick vectoring simulator for the website, assuming you have some suitable programming skills. Here's what I have in mind. So let me go back to the website. Up on the website, I have a page that's built that's not filled out yet in any meaningful way called Website Simulators. And I'm looking to get some different kinds of simulators / training apps / video games, if you want, built. And for this Deadstick vectoring simulator, here's what I loosely have in mind. First of all, a controller, could sit down and they could center it on any area of the country, so they could practice in their airspace. You cocould go somewhere else if you want. You could set some basic weather conditions with cloud cover and visibility, so you can make it nice VMC. You could make it kind of low IFR, 1,000-foot ceilings, whatever. You could throw in some reasonable winds that are realistic, including the surface winds, the winds aloft. You could set some airplane filters, so it's essentially altitude-based. If you just want to work airplanes that are 3,000 feet AGL and below, you could do that. If you want to go from, say, 5,000 to 15,000, you could, and so on. And then you would have random airplanes kind of flying around the airspace, and then one airplane at a time, okay, or just one airplane, would have an engine failure, and suddenly you have to identify that airplane, figure out what airport's the nearest airport, what's suitable, are there other airports, what are the factors that go into it, or if you were inclined, you could just directly pick one or another. So I could picture an OJTI with a developmental doing something like that. And then you would vector the airplane in towards the runway, and the simulator, among other things, could have rules to limit the number of vectors, including the timing. So you can't just do a vector, 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 vector. That's not realistic. You can't issue a vector every 3 seconds to a real airplane. So it might be you issue one vector, and then you're sort of locked out of any vectoring for a little bit. And you could attach other things to it. And then as far as training, what I'm loosely calling scoring, one option is this could be done completely de-identified. People could just get in there and just practice, and it just makes you better, and it's utterly, totally de-identified. You could also have different ways of identifying sort of loosely in some sense, or you could have the option of just practicing whatever you want, totally de-identified, but you could also kind of shoot for high scores, okay? And when you're trying to achieve a high score and you're asking it to score you before you run the scenario, we could be collecting data still de-identified, at least in the aggregate, and just kind of see what accuracy levels are realistically achievable. So the individual efforts could be still de-identified, but we could have people really trying to do their best, and we could kind of see what sort of vertical windows people are able to hit in simulated conditions, and that would help refine this so that we avoid that. That's the goal of this video. It's not so much to defend for legal liability purposes how hard this is for controllers, although I suppose it has that usefulness. The idea here is to give us some incentive to improve this so that with training we can maybe get to something like that and make these landings better so that we don't have to put them into a field and we don't send them into a house or a hotel unintentionally. Thank you.